We offer this as the Larry James Memorial Lecture. As I've described, there are a few handful of people that were the scholars of the 70s, of the 80s, and the 70s and the 80s, upon whose shoulders Jeff and I and the rest of us stand. And so Larry made countless contributions in a variety of areas, and it's always special to take this one time a year and remember all that he did. So we're thankful for that. Today's presenter, Jeff Edwards. So I'm really torn, right? Because I'm anxious to hear what he has to say, but I also, in the introduction, want to do him justice. But I just don't think I could spend as much time as would be required to fully do him justice, so I will be brief. All right? He published in every journal, every top journal, methodologically and substantively. He has been editorial board, associate editor, editor of several of our top journals. He has been recognized with positions of leadership in several of our national organizations. He, equally as important, is amongst a very small group of folks that over the 20 years has regularly answered the phone when I called or responded to an email that came along after, somewhere in the middle of those 20 years. But Jeff has believed in karma and has just given very generously of his time. He has simply helped redefine the way we think about difference scores, the way we think about multidimensional constructs, the way we think about formative measurement models, the way we talk about mediation and moderation, and there's an equally long list of topics on the substantive side for which he has made a contribution. 17 years as a distinguished professor. The only best thing I can say is to fully understand Jeff, read his Vita, because it documents a history of productivity and service to the profession that is probably unmatched. So it's with a real warm spot in my heart that I welcome back to Karma my dear friend, Jeff Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
I'm on?
You got your water. Game on.
Okay, all right, very good. Thank you. Thanks to Larry for creating and maintaining an institution that has benefited so many of us and given us an opportunity to come together on topics that are about honing the craft of what we do, our research, and to also have we develop connections and friendships as well, both those of us who are on the delivery side and those of you who participate. So Karma has really become quite a touchstone for our field from a methods standpoint and from a collegial standpoint. I'm delighted to be here for the Larry James Memorial delivery webcast. Larry was indeed a dear friend of mine and someone who I learned from. I was fortunate enough to be one of the people who gave a presentation at his retirement, and it happened to be about moderation and mediation and really tracing some of the history back to Larry's groundbreaking work and how the rest of us are just, I think, just sort of following in the path that he forged for us. So my topic today, Larry and I discussed something having to do with the where we stand in terms of methods for integrating moderation and mediation, and what might be some future developments. And I've thought long and hard about what might be worthwhile, and it occurred to me there are two basic options, and I'll elaborate these in just a little bit here. One of them is that we can make these models more complex to better reflect the complexity of the theories that we work with. We can add more mediators, we can add more moderators, more independent variables, more dependent variables, work those out, and show you the results. And that would be one approach. I think, though, that would put the researcher in the position of being a consumer of those models developed by somebody else, someone who understands the mechanics behind them. Another approach is for us to all collectively go back to basics of how these models are developed. And I've adopted the latter approach. So in a sense, I'd like to invite you to step behind the curtain, so to speak, and I'm going to talk you through how I'll use an example model, but I don't mean for this to be the be-all, end-all model. Instead, I want to articulate step by step the thought process that goes behind how we specify these models, how we estimate them, how we interpret the results, and how we pull it all together. So this is going to be dominated by the mediation part of it, because I think that is really the aspect that is least well understood. Moderation, I'll be adding moderators to the model as well and talking through the thought process there. But let me invite you to join me with sort of a behind-the-scenes look at how these models are put together, how you might think them through for your own purposes, so you can be the master of your own methodology when it comes to dealing with models such as this one. As a brief introduction, the kinds of models that we're talking about having to do with including moderation and mediation jointly. I'll give you two classic examples. One of them is the job characteristics model, where we have critical psychological states and then motivation, and then, job characteristics, critical psychological states, and then outcomes like motivation. So there's a mediation with three steps in terms of the three categories of variables involved, with growth needs strength as a moderator of those two key linkages. So that's an example that many people in organizational behavior would be familiar with. Expectancy theory has expectancy, instrumentality, and valence as effectively a three-way interaction, and the sense is that the effect of those three attributes brought together on performance is mediated by motivation. And so we have a kind of a three-way interaction whose the explanation of the why question of how it relates to performance has to do with motivation as a mediator. And so you can think of these kinds of models as whenever we combine moderation and mediation are combined whenever we have causal paths in a model that we believe depend upon some moderator variable, the size, the magnitude, the direction of those paths depend upon a moderator variable, or we believe that some type of interaction is transmitted through a mediated variable. I don't mean a product term. A product term itself doesn't have causal potency. I mean the interaction or the moderation of a pair of variables, or maybe more than one variable, more than two variables, excuse me, that when we try to explain how that interaction it causes an outcome, and introducing an explanation as a mediating variable. So the methods involved. I mentioned that you can trace much of this work back to Larry James. James and Brett, 1984, was a classic piece on moderation and mediation and their combination. Barron and Kenny, although primarily about mediation, also had some discussion of how moderation could be incorporated into such models. Some more recent work, I wrote a paper with Lisa Lambert that was published in 2007, and concurrently Chris Preacher and Andy Hayes and others were involved in the same kinds of efforts. This article I'm mentioning here was published in Multivariate Behavioral Research, and then more recently Andy Hayes has really picked up the charge in terms of writing books about combining moderation and mediation. This is his 2013 first edition of his book, and there's a new edition coming out later this year. That's kind of where we stand right now in terms of a status report. So the path forward. Much of the paths forward. Much of the work around mediation, as you probably know, is based on a simple little three-variable model with an X causing an M causing a Y. Lisa and I did that in our article. Barron and Kenny focused on that type of model. It's the familiar model, sort of the stock in trade as we discuss mediation and then elaborate on those models by applying moderators. But admittedly, that model vastly understates the complexity of the theories that we deal with. And anyone with a back of an envelope and a pen and some creativity is going to come up with a model that has more than three variables in it, with arrows going all over the place like a network diagram, and then moderators poking in various kinds of places. So we need to allow the methodology to be aligned with the complexity and thoughtfulness of the theories that we might develop, might sketch out, and then want to test. So not only are there a lot of variables that can be involved in terms of the x's and the m's and the y's and the moderators, but the moderators can point to any path in the model. Any path can have multiple moderators on it. So the complexity is incredible in terms of the models that we could consider. So what do we do to address that variety of models? One approach is rely on the experts. Look to those who grapple with these questions, develop models of various types, try to develop a set of models that would be commensurate with the kinds of situations that we encounter as researchers. And that's one way to go. And people who do that kind of work are doing a service for us. Another is for us to collectively return to first principles and try to get a good fundamental understanding of how any model, how it is, once we've developed it in terms of maybe we sketch it out, we think through the logic of it, we develop theoretical explanations for the relationships in that model. Once we get that far, then how do we translate that model into something that can be estimated, something that can be interpreted, something that can be formally tested? And there are principles that I think have been lost that we could return to or maybe resurrect. If we rely on the experts, I want to again point out Andy Hayes as probably exemplar of the person who's on the forefront of expanding the set of models that we test. He has a set of models that are built into the process macro that many of you have probably heard of. It's developed for SPSS and for SAS. Last time I checked, there were over 70 models, I think, that you can if you can find your model, then you can identify, say, here are my variables, here's the independent variable, the dependent variable, here are mediating variables, here's moderator variables, and then execute the code. Once you run process in SPSS, then it becomes a command. Execute that command, and you get results. And I'm aware that if you look at Andy's website, that there is with the new book coming out, there's more flexibility being built into the process macro in terms of specifying your own models. You're limited naturally with any kind of tool. You're limited to what that tool is designed to do. If you can find your model in the set that is accommodated by the current version of process, then great. If not, then you're more on your own. Again, I think the flexibility is coming. We'll see what becomes of the version. It's version 3 of the macro. So we can rely on the good-hearted people like Andy Hayes to develop methods for us and align those with our models.